This episode is supported by MonsterJoysticks.com. Level up your Raspberry Pi with our all-in-one arcade kit using genuine Sanwa arcade parts. And OneClickPrint.com for your photos on canvas, acrylic, gifts and more. Local craftsmen and global delivery.
Hello cave dwellers, welcome to the cave for a kind of condensed trash to treasure if you like today. It's all about this system, the Commodore Amiga A1500, which is technically a rebadged A2000. And we know this because there's a whole video dedicated to it on my channel about the history of the A1500. It's a really interesting story, and it's a story that hasn't really concluded yet. There'll be a link in the description below if you want to watch that video. And that's the reason it's a slightly different trash to treasure. The backstory to the machine is already out there. You can go and watch that now. Think of that as a part 1. And now we're on to parts 2 and 3, where we get to know what's inside it, what the problem is, and we're going to fix it today as well. So let's get stuck in. If the bald beardy man says we should get stuck in, then let's get stuck in and let's get right to the symptoms then. When I turn our Amiga on, any number of the things you're seeing now happen. We might get a guru meditation like this, a black screen, the brief glimpse of a kickstart screen followed by nothingness, sometimes white, sometimes black, and sometimes it looks like all is well, but the smallest vibration will cause it to fall over again. And by small vibration, I mean giving it a thump. It's all rather unusual, and the Amiga isn't helping us much in diagnosing the problem. Often it will display a coloured screen to identify where the fault is, but pink isn't one of those colours. And the OSSC upscaler I'm using shows us that the video signal is sometimes intermittent from the Amiga. We should have a solid output at 15 kHz, but it's flashing away here receiving that intermittent signal. Now there is a simple solution to this, and that's to give Commodore a call. Or at least it would be if we'd completed our Amiga value added care form and put it in the post. Oh, and we were 30 years in the past. So I guess we're going to have to fix this one ourselves. So let's take the lid off and see what makes up the Amiga 1500 or 2000. If you watched my Amiga 500 restoration, then you'll be familiar with the chipset in the Amiga 2000, but there are some key differences which justify its big box form factor. The usual motley crew are here, including 2 CIA chips which handle peripheral interfacing, the keyboard, parallel port, serial port, floppy control, joysticks and such. These chips are a presence in all Amigas except the CD32, in which the Akiko chips handles those tasks. Gary's also here, which is short for Gate Array, and he integrates many of the functions which were built discreetly on the earlier Amiga 1000 to reduce cost, glue logic, bus control and that sort of thing. Paula is the 8-bit PCM audio chip that gives the Amiga its voice, while Denise handles most of the graphic-related tasks, including support for up to 8 hardware sprites and a palette of 4096 colours. The number of on-screen colours at once varies according to the resolution in use. Now here's an interesting one. Fat Lady, that's a name we didn't see in the Amiga 500, but you may be able to guess what it is. In the A500 it's called Agnes, and later revisions are named Fat Agnes. Fat Lady is a memory controller which also handles video timing, and the blitter and copper functions which helped the Amiga to manipulate images at high speed and create unique and interesting effects. Why it's called Fat Lady and not Fat Agnes here? I can't really answer that, but so long as the Fat Lady sings, I'm happy. The CPU is the same Motorola 68000 CPU as the Amiga 500, running at 7.09 MHz in my PAL region. And the ROM is our Kickstart ROM, which is a version 1.3 in this instance, but it can be swapped out for newer or even older versions. This revision 6 motherboard has 1MB of chip RAM soldered directly onto the motherboard, and that's easily expandable as we'll see. There's another chip here we wouldn't have seen in the A500, and that's Buster. Buster's purpose is to handle the Zorro slots, and those slots again are something we didn't see in the cheaper Wedge model. So what is it that warrants the big box nature of the A2000 over the A500? The A2000 gives us a CPU upgrade slot, making it quick and easy to bypass the base model CPU with something much faster. And these upgrade cards also often have additional RAM on board to elevate the machine to something a lot more powerful. No less than 5 Zorro 2 slots are present for the many Amiga expansion boards which were on the market, but we also have both 8 and 16-bit ISA slots, and these are the very same IBM PC compatible slots. The Amiga can't talk to these ISA slots, they're disabled if you like by default. They require a PC bridge board to be installed, and that in turn allows you to run an IBM PC compatible environment within your Amiga that can then talk to those expansion cards. You could, for example, install a Sound Blaster card if you wanted and run MS-DOS and some games. Why not? So as you can see, the basic chipset configuration offers little above and beyond an Amiga 500, but the expansion capabilities mean that this could very quickly be upgraded to a high-end machine inside that nice roomy case. So where amongst that collection of chips could our fault lay today? Well, some basic checks were carried out first to ensure that all of the chips are seated correctly and in their sockets, and everything appears to be sitting just fine. What struck me when I got this machine was just how clean it was, and I also noticed that the Varta battery, which so often leaks on these boards, had been replaced with a CR battery modification, which was a nice surprise really. It did also raise alarms for me though. Was that a proactive modification, or was a battery leak cleaned up and possible damage caused before it was fitted? If it had leaked, then the CPU is in the direct firing line of any leak, as is the Kickstart ROM, which isn't too far away either, so it made sense to start my investigations there. The Kickstart ROM has certainly been removed before, as is evident from the screwdriver marks on the socket, but there were none of the telltale signs of battery corrosion. But when we looked at the CPU, that was a different story. When I ease the 68000 CPU out here, you can immediately see, if you look close enough, some green corrosion on the pins to the left of the picture here, and the dulled metal legs of the CPU perhaps indicate that they've been cleaned off once before, or maybe that's just the corrosion working its way up the legs. Either way, it's not a good sign. If we peer down into the CPU socket, you can see that corrosion, especially on the first pin, which is completely green, so perhaps a cleanup job was performed on this board, and a pretty good one at that, but a small part was missed and the socket has been quietly corroding out of sight. My first approach then was to give the socket a good cleanup and just get a good enough contact with the CPU pins to prove conclusively that this was the fault before performing a permanent repair. But things soon worsened. When I went to work on scrubbing that socket, if you watch very closely, you'll see I disturbed the first pin and half of it falls right out the socket. The pin has in fact corroded right through and is in two pieces. What the pin should really look like is this. If I take a pin out of a new socket here, you can see that it's a single piece of metal that the chip pushes into the top of, and the pin then goes through a hole in the PCB to be soldered on the underside. 64 of these pins make up the DIP64 socket on the Amiga board, and we've got 63 good pins on ours, if not fewer. There's the other half of our pin. I found it after a bit of hunting around. So there's only one thing for it really. We need to take out the CPU socket completely, check if there's any more damage occurring underneath it, and clean it up if there is, and then I think I'll fit a whole new socket. Here's the underside of that socket if we turn the board over, and it's two rows of 32 pins, all of which we need to desolder. Now it's normally at this point in the video where I grab my cheap solder sucker and soldering iron and very slowly remove the solder, but we've got a new toy today to help us. So I'll start by plastering on lots of flux paste to help get the old solder flowing when we heat it. And then look how easy this makes desoldering. This is my new vacuum desoldering gun, which heats up the solder, and then with the pull of a trigger it sucks away the solder. And it's just shaved about an hour off the time this normally would have taken me to do this. Even with this, there are occasions when the solder won't come out and you just need to add a bit of fresh new solder, then that can help get any of the stubborn old solder molten and moving again. Now, as time-saving as my new toy might be, it's not a simple case of lifting the socket out of the board. Some of those legs still have a tiny bit of solder holding them in, and when you times that by 64 or 63 in our case, then there's still quite a grip on the board. So to avoid any damage, I like to use a hot air gun just to warm up the legs with that excess flux still around them, and then that gets things moving so that we can remove the socket without any damage to the board. When we look under that socket, we didn't have any nasty surprises waiting for us to clean up, so I just gave it a scrub with some IPA, and I was happy that the pads were in a good condition and the damage seemed to be isolated to the CPU socket only. I just cleaned up and scraped a little muck off of the pads. It really didn't need anything more. And now the new socket goes in, making sure it's nice and flush to the board, and I've used some tape to keep it in place while I solder on all the legs. This is the same socket as you'll see in other Amigas like the 500, so exactly the same method you're seeing here can be applied to your Amiga 500 if you're having a similar issue with that machine. And remember, when we're soldering here, we're heating the leg and bringing the solder to it to get a nice uniform shiny peaks. If this isn't working for you, check your temperature is high enough. I'm running at about 350 degrees C, and I used the same temperature to desolder the socket in the first place. With the socket installed, we can put in the CPU, and this isn't the one I took out, I'm using a spare. The one I took out I will clean up with some white vinegar to get rid of the corrosion, and then use it in an A500 I need to fix up. The question then is, did we fix the problem? There's only one way to find out, so let's put it all back together, fire it up, and see what happens. Our answer is an emphatic yes. Our Kickstart screen appears, and a 3D flight simulation in their finest hour puts the CPU through its paces, and it hasn't missed a beat. I've had no problems at all with the machine since replacing the socket, and I can slap it about as much as I like, and it diligently takes me to Monkey Island. Look, a three-headed monkey. Well, I thought that was a very satisfying fix. We got to the root of the problem and we've conclusively got it fixed, and it's working like a dream now, like the day it was made. It helps that it was already pretty clean. I really don't know the history of why it was clean. As I mentioned in the video, I think there may have been a leakage, and they've done a good job of cleaning it up. They just missed that tiny piece which led to the corrosion, which led to the damage. But we got it fixed. We also got to play with a new toy today, which was nice. If you'd like to see that in more detail, I'll be happy to put a review together and tell you all about that. Now, what do we do next with this? We're not finished yet. I'd certainly like to retrobrite the plastics. The more observant of you would have also noticed there's a broken key on the keyboard down there, so we need to get that fixed and retrobrighted as well. That will get it looking like new, but we've got this big box Amiga, which is essentially at the moment little more than an A500. And there's all that space for expansion. So if this was yours, if you had an Amiga 2000, maybe you have an Amiga 2000, what would you put inside? What would be the ideal dream upgrade for our A1500/2000? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see if I can make that happen, as well as the retro brighting, in part 2. See you then. As always, thank you for watching, and take care.